Before 1965, which was only 59 years ago, there were no British laws that prevented anyone from being denied housing or jobs because of their race. It was not illegal to discriminate someone due to the colour of their skin. And because of this, many black people that had migrated to England suffered a lot of racial prejudice and were denied jobs and housing. One man said at the time, "I wanted to go back home to Jamaica, but at the time I could not afford the fare back because I could not get a job." Over in America, black people were going through something similar. Segregation and Jim Crow laws were rife, and black people were being treated like they were second-class citizens or even third-class citizens. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that legalized racial segregation. It was like a racial caste system that enforced anti-black laws, but the black people of America fought back against these laws. We've all heard the heroic stories of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., famous for his contributions towards the American civil rights movement by the marches he led for the rights of black people to vote and for equality. And there were many civil rights activists in America who advocated for the equal rights of black people. We also remember the story of Rosa Parks, a black activist in the American civil rights movement, best known for not giving up her seat on the bus for a white person and being arrested for it, sparking the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955, which ended 13 months later when the US Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, a landmark victory in the fight for equality. It's not often talked about and it's not as commonly known, but Britain also had a civil rights movement. This video is a story of the Bristol Bus Boycott, which would go on to help change the entire country in terms of racial discrimination and equality, and paved the way for the Race Relations Act of 1965. In England in the 1950s and 60s, there was no anti-discrimination laws, which allowed racial discrimination to go on unchecked in areas such as housing, employment, and public services. Black employees were only accepted into menial, low-paying jobs, and black workers faced lower pay for the same work as their white co-workers. Black people would be overlooked for jobs and promotions, and barriers to career progression were put up. It was the same in education, public services and housing, with many houses for rent advertising their no blacks policies, which hindered social advancement for black people. Tired and fed up with this inequality, grassroots movements for racial equality in the UK began to emerge. One such movement was the West Indian Development Council, formed by 4 West Indian men, Roy Hackett, the founder of the council, as well as Owen Henry, Audley Evans, and Prince Brown. Unhappy with the lack of progress in the fight for racial equality, Owen Henry met up with Paul Stephenson, a 25-year-old British-born black man who had been born and raised in England and so had a British accent, which was very rare at the time. They all decided that because of this, he would be their spokesman. The group then decided to set up a test case to prove and confirm without a doubt that there was a colour bar against black people in England. And in 1963, after seeing an advert for jobs for bus drivers at the Omnibus Bus Company in Bristol, they applied for a job with the bus company for a then 18-year-old young black man called Guy Bailey. Guy Bailey had arrived in England from Jamaica in 1961 at age 16. Seen as Paul Stephenson had been born and raised in Britain and so had the British accent, he telephoned the bus company and was told that there were plenty of driver's jobs available, and an interview was arranged for Guy Bailey for 2 p.m. that day. When Guy arrived for his interview at the Omnibus Bus Company and told the receptionist that he was there for his job interview, the receptionist called out to her boss, "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here," and he's black. The then manager of the Omnibus Company didn't even bother to come out of his office, instead shouting back, "Tell him there's no vacancies. We don't hire blacks here." This kicked off a chain of events. In April 1963, the West Indian Development Council decided that they were then going to boycott the Bristol Omnibus Bus Company, inspired by the 1955 Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott in America, and start a walk to work campaign. And it wasn't just black people who boycotted the Bristol Omnibus buses. People of all races joined in the boycott, and more than 100 university students from the nearby Bristol University marched in protest of the colour bar, carrying posters and shouting slogans. There were heated arguments between the protesting students and the bus drivers as they came off duty, with one driver saying, "We have nothing personal against the coloured men, but with the present state of unemployment, we don't want them or any other people from abroad coming over here and trying to grab our jobs." The case gained national attention from the media, and it was noted that the omnibus depot on London Road in Bristol did not allow black or Asian people to work on buses or in their garages, saying, "We have no West Indians here at all. That is the company's policy."
What you want, Mr. Green, is to restrict the numbers of coloured people who come and get jobs in the transport department as drivers and conductors.
Well, that's what I'm instructed to do by my bench.
The point is that whilst we can obtain white labour in this city, we intend to go on engaging white labour rather than coloured labour.
Well, we don't want them on there, that's the main reason. I mean, you come to look at it this way, when old Beeching drops his axe, there ain't going to be enough work for the whites, let alone the blacks. We got enough our job now to get a working wage. If we don't get our bit of overtime, we can't live. If they come down here, they'll work all hours God give them.
What do you think about coloured people coming to work on the buses?
I don't like the idea very much.
Why not?
I wouldn't like to work with them at night.
Well, I think the majority of them are just ignorant.
But there are a lot of white ignorant people too, aren't there?
Well, we can put up with them.
Personally, I couldn't see it working out. It might, but it does in other towns, but I don't think it would in Bristol, because I think the racial feeling is worse here.
Ian Patey, the 63-year-old Omnibus Company manager, stated, "We employ coloured men in our garages, but not on our buses. Services which have employed coloured labour are the worst for it. The advent of coloured crews would mean a gradual falling off of white staff. It's true that London Transport employs a large coloured staff. They even have recruiting offices in Jamaica, and they subsidise the fare to Britain of their new coloured employees. As a result of this, the amount of white labour dwindles steadily on the London Underground. You won't get a white man in London admit it, but which of them will join a service where they may find themselves working under a coloured foreman?" Ian Patey also said, "I understand that in London, coloured men become arrogant and rude after they have been employed for some months. White bus workers said that they would strike if black people were hired, or that they would withdraw their political allegiance from the Labour Party, as Harold Wilson, the then shadow Foreign Secretary, spoke out against the colour bar, saying, 'I'm glad so many Bristolians are supporting the campaign to get the colour bar abolished. We wish them every success. Whilst MP Tony Benn, who also supported the boycott, stated, "I shall stay off the buses even if I have to find a bike." And he also stood in the road with the protesters and drank tea with them. Stan Arbery, a Labour MP, asked the then Transport Minister, Mr Ernest Marples, whether he was aware of racial policies being operated by some companies, saying, "We don't want apartheid in Bristol." Apartheid was a system of laws separating people based on their race and ethnicity in South Africa, in which black people were deprived of civil and political rights, and this was fought fiercely by heroes such as Nelson Mandela. But the Bristol Bus Boycott was not supported by all, with the Omnibus Company stating that they would rather have a shortage of buses than employ a non-white person. Trade union leaders of the TGWU, which stands for Transport and General Workers Union, and the Bishop of Bristol sided with the Omnibus Bus Company, with church leaders condemning the actions of the bus boycott and the West Indian Development Council, but in the same breath also condemning racial prejudice. Leary Constantine, a Trinidadian cricketer and a High Commissioner for Trinidad and Tobago, also spoke out about the colour bar and in support of the Bristol Bus Boycott. Demonstrations were held outside 2 bus company depots, where demonstrators then marched to the headquarters of the TGWU, Transport and General Workers Union, where union officials stated, "We have no right to tell anyone who they may or may not employ." It's fair to note that no one could be employed by the bus services unless they belonged to and were approved by the TGWU, who said that if black workers were hired, then there would be overtime cuts, if not job losses. In 1955, 8 years before the Bristol Bus Boycott, the passenger group, which represented drivers and conductors and was a branch of the TGWU, passed a vote that black workers should not be employed as bus crews. And 7 years later, in March 1962, and 1 year before the Bristol Bus Boycott, at a meeting of Bristol's Transport Committee, Ian Patey stated that there was factual evidence that the presence of a black crew would downgrade the job and drive existing staff away. The committee voted not to overturn the policy of the colour bar, prohibiting black and Asian people from being employed to drive buses. During the Bristol Bus Boycott, the TGWU Secretary, Ron Nethercott, rejected Paul, the British-born black man who had been the one to first phone the bus company on behalf of Guy Bailey about a job vacancy, as the leader of West Indians, saying that he had jeopardised the welfare of British black people. Ron Nethercott also launched a verbal attack on Paul Stephenson in the media, calling him dishonest and irresponsible, which led to Paul Stephenson launching a libel lawsuit in the High Courts, which Paul won and was awarded damages and costs. And Paul Stephenson, a district youth officer employed by Bristol Education Committee, received death threats and verbal abuse on the streets, with those against the Bristol Bus Boycott saying white women would be frightened to travel on the late night buses if black men were working on them. But it wasn't just white people that opposed the bus boycott. There was opposition from a small minority of black people who said to the men of the West Indian Development Council, "You're making it difficult for us to settle in. This is a white man's country, and white man can do what he wants in his own country. We can't impose any restrictions on how he wants to behave." 4 months after the Bristol Bus Boycott had started, On the 28th of August 1963, probably due to a drastic decrease in revenue and due to the high negative publicity they had been receiving, the Bristol Omnibus Company backed down and changed their policies, allowing black and Asian people to now be allowed to work on the buses, a landmark victory in the UK's fight for civil rights movement. On the same day that the Bristol Bus Company backed down and changed its policies, over in America, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
Just as I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
In 1964, just over a year after the victory of the Bristol Bus Boycott, Labour MP Harold Wilson, who had supported the Bristol Bus Boycott, became Prime Minister of England, where he set about making anti-racist legislation and laws, bringing in the Race Relations Bill of 1965, making it an illegal offence to discriminate anyone on the grounds of colour, race, or ethnic or national origins. The Act also made it illegal to incite racial hatred. Harold Wilson said that it was the Bristol Bus Boycott that had inspired him to bring in anti-racist legislation. Following the success of the Bristol Bus Boycott, the first non-white person to work on the buses was a 37-year-old married father of 3, originally from India, now living in Clifton, Bristol for the past 2 years, a Sikh graduate called Ragbir Singh, who was employed a month later as a bus conductor. Ragbir Singh had given up his well-paid job as an engine fitter and taken a lesser-paying job working on the buses, saying, "I applied for the job to see if the bus company kept its word." Ragbir was put to work on the number 9 bus as a conductor, and after his first shift he told reporters, "I've had a beautiful day, not a bit of worry. The busmen have all been very kind and friendly. Before I started, the chief came up to me and said, 'If there's any difficulty, come to me and talk it over.' My driver was a beautiful chap. We had a cup of tea together afterwards, and he asked if I enjoyed the journey. People all day have been wishing me all the luck." Ragbir Singh's driver was 23-year-old Roger Wilson, who said, "He's all right, mate. Colour does not worry me. They can be black, blue or yellow." Within days, 2 black Jamaicans, Norman Samuels and Norris Edwards, as well as 2 Asian men from Pakistan, Mohammed Rashid and Abbas Ali, were also hired as conductors on the buses, with Norman Samuels, the Jamaican, going on to become the first black driver of the buses in October 1964, saying that on his first journey driving the bus, people lined the streets to see a black man drive the bus, as it was a novelty no one had ever seen in England before.